The sky was the color of dry dust, heavy with heat, the kind that makes every breath feel slow. A quiet hush lay over the small frontier town, broken only by the restless shuffle of boots on cracked boards. People gathered around the wooden platform in the center of the square, drawn by something cruel and strange. A young woman stood there, her back straight though her hands trembled against the rough rope that marked the edge. Her dress clung to her in the late afternoon sun, the soft swell of her stomach giving away the secret she carried. She was clearly expecting a child, yet she faced the crowd like a prisoner on display. Her eyes were wide and tired, fixed on nothing, as if looking at anyone would invite more shame. Beside her, two older men barked sharp words to the onlookers. Their voices were eager and cold, like traders at a market. They called her their kin, though their faces held no kindness. They spoke of arrangements and offers, but everyone understood what was really happening. They were auctioning her off, selling her like a mule, and the child she carried was nothing more than part of the bargain. Each word they threw into the dry air landed with a bitter weight. Some people shifted uncomfortably, others pretended to be curious. No one stepped forward. In the back of the crowd, a tall rancher watched with a frown carved deep into his sun-browned face. His name wasn't spoken much in town. Folks knew him as the man with the failing ranch beyond the ridge. Years of hard seasons had left his land thirsty and his pockets thin. He had no wife, no children, and no reason to be at an auction like this. Yet he stood there, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the woman on the platform. Something in her stillness caught him. Maybe it was the way she held her chin high even as her own family treated her like property. Maybe it was the quiet desperation that flickered in her gaze whenever she looked toward the dusty horizon, as though she were praying for a miracle no one could see. The rancher shifted his weight, boots grinding against the dirt. He told himself to look away. He had enough troubles of his own. His cattle were thin, the creek on his land was nearly dry, and the bank was waiting for payment he didn't have. Taking on someone else's burden would only drag him deeper into the hole. But his eyes refused to leave the platform. Each call for bids rang like a hammer against his chest. The men shouted numbers and offers, turning a human life into a bargain. The woman never flinched, though her hands tightened on the rope until her knuckles went white. A breeze stirred, lifting the brim of his hat, carrying the sharp scent of sweat and fear through the air. The rancher felt something shift inside him, something stronger than reason. He thought of the long nights on his ranch, the silent rooms, the empty porch at sunset. He thought of his own mother, gone too soon, and how no woman deserved to be treated like a sack of grain. His heart beat heavier with each call from the platform. Someone laughed, a cruel, dry sound, and the woman's shoulders stiffened just for a moment before she steadied herself again. The crowd murmured, some curious, some entertained, a few uneasy. Children clung to their mothers, eyes wide. Men with hard faces leaned against posts, waiting to see if anyone would step forward. The rancher's jaw tightened. He could hear the whisper of his own conscience, sharp and unrelenting. It told him that walking away would be easier, that he owed nothing to this stranger, that he barely had enough for himself. But beneath the noise of reason was another voice, quieter and stronger, telling him that a person cannot watch injustice and remain a bystander. The woman's eyes flicked toward the crowd, scanning faces that refused to meet hers. For the briefest second, her gaze met his. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even hope. It was a simple recognition, a flash of humanity in a place that had forgotten it. Something in that look burned through him like a spark finding dry grass. He felt his breath catch, the sound of the crowd fading into a dull hum. His hand brushed the brim of his hat as if steadying himself against a decision he hadn't yet spoken. The men on the platform called again, louder this time, their voices sharp with impatience. The rancher felt his pulse drum against his ribs. Around him, people shifted, waiting for someone else to act. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the sense that if he stayed silent, the world would remain just as cruel as it had been a minute before. The heat, the dust, the murmurs, All of it seemed to narrow into a single point where choice became unavoidable. He took a slow breath, tasting the grit of the dry air, and stepped forward through the crowd. The ranch stretched far beyond what the eye could hold, a sweep of dry grass and stubborn sage that met the horizon in a haze of gold. From a distance it might look endless, but the man who owned it knew every fence post and every patch of earth that refused to yield. He rode the land each morning, not because it promised riches but because it demanded care. Years of drought had drained the soil, leaving the pastures thin and the cattle lean. Each hoofbeat of his horse was a reminder of debts waiting at the bank, of feed bills stacked on the table, of a life balanced on a blade too sharp to ignore. He worked until his muscles burned and his back stiffened, because there was no one else to carry the weight. Before the auction, his days followed a pattern carved by necessity. Dawn brought a pale light that cut through the cracks of his small wooden house. He woke before the rooster's call, pulled on worn boots, and stepped into the cold air that smelled of dry earth and faint wood smoke. The barn creaked in greeting as he checked on the horses, the cattle, the handful of chickens scratching at the dirt. Every living thing on that ranch depended on his hands, and he gave what he could, though it never felt like enough. The fences sagged in places, the well sometimes ran low, and the roof of the house rattled whenever the wind picked up. Yet he stayed, not out of stubborn pride but because the land, for all its hardships, felt like the only place where his heart could rest. People in town whispered about his misfortune. Some said he was cursed, others claimed he was too proud to ask for help. He didn't bother to correct them. He had no taste for gossip or pity. His closest companion was the silence of the plains, broken only by the lowing of cattle or the cry of a hawk overhead. At night, he would sit on the porch with a chipped mug of coffee, watching the stars gather across the black sky. He thought about the years gone by, about the dreams he once carried when the ranch was new and the soil still held promise. He remembered a time when he planned to build more than fences and barns, when he imagined a family, children running through the tall grass, laughter echoing across the hills. Those dreams faded with each failed harvest and each letter from the bank. He stopped thinking about marriage, about love, about anything that might require hope. Yet loneliness has a way of settling into a man's bones. It shows itself in small moments. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the quiet of a cold morning, the echo of his own voice when he speaks to the animals. He sometimes caught himself talking to the wind, sharing thoughts with no one but the open sky. It wasn't madness, just the natural response to years without another soul to listen. He told himself he was fine, that he needed nothing more than the land and the work, but some nights the silence pressed too hard, and he felt the ache of a life lived without warmth. His parents had been settlers, tough and hopeful when they claimed this piece of earth. They raised him to believe that hard work could tame any wilderness. His father died young, a broken leg turning into a fever the doctor couldn't stop. His mother carried on until her own strength gave out, leaving the ranch to him before he was ready. He buried them both on a hill that overlooked the fields, marking their graves with simple wooden crosses. Each time he passed that hill, he felt their presence like a quiet urging to keep going, to honor the sweat and sacrifice that built the home he now struggled to keep. He worked not only for himself but for the memory of those who had believed in this place. Despite the harsh seasons and the endless work, there was a gentleness in him that refused to die. He nursed injured calves back to health, fed stray dogs that wandered onto the property, and took time to mend the smallest broken things. He treated the animals with care, speaking to them as if they understood. When storms threatened, he stayed awake through the night, guiding the herd to safety and checking every gate. His calloused hands could still cradle a newborn lamb without harm. That quiet kindness set him apart from the harder men in town, men who drank too much and boasted too loudly. He kept to himself, earning respect even from those who didn't understand him. Money was a constant shadow. Each trip to the bank tightened the knot in his stomach. He sold cattle when prices were low because he had no choice, patched equipment instead of buying new, and bartered with neighbors for what he couldn't afford. Every decision carried the weight of survival. The thought of hiring help was laughable. He managed alone, even when his body ached from dawn to dusk. Nights brought little relief. Sleep came in restless fragments, broken by worries of rain that never came and bills that never stopped. Still, he rose each morning, driven by a sense of duty that went deeper than fear. On the day of the auction, he hadn't planned to go into town. He had a list of chores waiting: a fence to mend, a lame horse to tend, a stretch of pasture to inspect before dusk. But a nagging thought pulled at him as he saddled his horse. Supplies were running low, and the small general store might not wait another week for payment. He convinced himself the trip was necessary. As he rode toward town, the wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass, the familiar smells of a land clinging to life. He followed the narrow trail past the ridge, the sun sharp on his back, unaware that the path would lead him to a moment that would alter everything. The town appeared slowly on the horizon, a scatter of wooden buildings huddled against the wide sky. He passed the church with its peeling white paint, the blacksmith's shop ringing with the sound of hammer on iron, the saloon where laughter spilled out into the street. He tied his horse near the general store and noticed the unusual crowd gathering near the square. Curiosity pulled him closer, though he expected nothing more than a sale of livestock or equipment. As he approached, he caught the murmur of voices, the sharp calls of men competing for attention. Then he saw her. At first she was just a figure in the distance, a small silhouette against the rough boards of the platform. The closer he came, the clearer the details became. The curve of her swollen belly beneath a faded dress, the way her hair clung to her neck in the heat, the pale determination in her posture. His steps slowed without his permission. He had heard rumors of hardship in town, but nothing prepared him for the sight of a young woman being offered to the highest bidder by the very people meant to protect her. He felt a surge of anger before he even understood the situation. The men beside her, older, hard-eyed, spoke with the slick tone of traders, describing her as if she were a piece of land or a strong mule. They mentioned her pregnancy only to sweeten the deal, a cruel attempt to raise the price. The crowd shifted uneasily, some whispering, others watching with a cold curiosity. No one moved to stop it. He recognized a few faces, neighbors and townsfolk who looked away when his eyes met theirs. Something in him rebelled against the scene. He thought of his mother's kindness, of the respect his father carried even in the hardest years. He thought of the loneliness that had become his constant companion, and how this woman, though a stranger, deserved more than the humiliation unfolding before her. He stood at the edge of the crowd, jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides. The sun beat down, hot and unrelenting, but a colder weight settled in his chest. His mind flickered through practical reasons to stay silent. He had no money for bidding, no business interfering in the affairs of another family, no strength to take on a burden when his own life was already stretched thin. Logic told him to turn away, to finish his errands and return to the ranch before nightfall. Yet the more he tried to reason, the stronger the pull became. Each shout from the platform rang against his ears like a dare. Each uneasy glance from the townsfolk reminded him that silence would make him complicit. He watched the woman closely. Despite the cruel spectacle, she stood with a dignity that defied her captors. Her hands trembled only slightly as she held her stomach, as if shielding the child within from the ugliness around her. Her eyes scanned the crowd, meeting gaze after gaze that quickly slid away. When her eyes finally met his, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't a plea or a cry for rescue. It was recognition, two souls seeing each other in a world that had turned cold. The rancher felt the moment settle deep inside him like a stone dropped into water. The ripples of it spread through his chest, pushing aside fear, debt, and the endless list of chores waiting back home. He couldn't name the feeling, only that it demanded action. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry earth and horses, and he knew he would not leave this square as the same man who entered it. The young woman on the platform had once been a wife, a daughter-in-law, a quiet presence in a small farmhouse on the edge of the prairie. Before this day she had cooked meals over a smoky stove, mended torn shirts by lamplight, and dreamed of a child she thought would grow in a safe and loving home. Her world had not always been cruel. There were moments, not long ago, when she laughed with her husband under the stars and believed that the life they built together would last. But life in a harsh land is a fragile thing. A sudden illness carried her husband away like a gust of winter wind, leaving her with a swelling belly and a house filled with people who saw her not as family but as a burden. His parents, the in-laws who now stood at her side like traders at a cattle market, had been cold from the beginning. They tolerated her while their son was alive, offering polite smiles and clipped words, but after his death their true faces emerged. To them, she was nothing more than a mouth to feed and a problem to solve. The child she carried, instead of being a blessing, became a threat to their small inheritance. They whispered in dark corners, their voices sharp and calculating, until whispers turned into plans. At first she tried to believe they would come to their senses. She told herself that grief made people cruel and that kindness would return with time. But each day their stares grew harder, their words more bitter, until she began to understand the depth of their resentment. When they announced their decision, she thought she had misheard. They spoke in calm, businesslike tones, as if arranging the sale of a wagon or a plot of land. They would not keep her, they said. The baby would bring shame, expense, trouble. Someone would pay for a young woman who could still work, and perhaps the child would sweeten the bargain. They told her it was for her own good, that she would find a new home with a man willing to take her in. Their voices were dry and practical, but their eyes held a satisfaction that chilled her. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but the weight of her condition and the isolation of the prairie pressed in on her like an iron gate. There was nowhere to go. Neighbors were miles away, and the nearest town offered only strangers who might be as cruel as the family who betrayed her. The night before the auction, she lay awake in the small room that had once been hers and her husband's. The familiar smell of wood smoke and worn quilts now felt like a prison. She listened to the wind rattling the shutters and tried to calm the pounding of her heart. The baby stirred inside her, a small flutter that reminded her of the life she carried and the promise she had once made to protect it. She whispered a soft promise into the darkness, that no matter what happened, she would keep the child safe. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain silent. Any sign of defiance would bring sharp words or worse. Morning came with a pale sun and a knock on the door. They gave her a dress that smelled of mothballs, one of her late husband's sisters fastening the buttons with quick, impersonal hands. No one spoke to her as they hitched the wagon. The ride to town was a blur of jolting wheels and biting wind. She sat on the hard seat, holding her belly with one hand and gripping the edge with the other. The world outside the wagon seemed distant and unreal, the golden fields and scattered trees passing like a dream she could no longer touch. At moments she thought of jumping, of running into the open land, but her swollen body betrayed her. Even if she escaped, where could she go? Hunger and exposure would be waiting on every side. When they reached the square, the sound of voices hit her like a wall. The crowd's murmur carried a mix of curiosity and unease. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, men adjusted their hats and leaned against posts, women whispered behind gloved hands. She felt their eyes slide over her, some filled with pity, others with cold appraisal. Her in-laws guided her to the wooden platform, their hands firm and unyielding. The boards beneath her feet creaked as she stepped up, each sound echoing like a warning. She lifted her chin, forcing her face into a mask of calm. Inside, her heart hammered so hard she feared it might break through her ribs. The men began to speak, their voices carrying across the square. They described her in measured terms, listing her age, her ability to work, the child she carried as though it were an asset. Each word cut deeper than the last. She kept her eyes fixed on a point beyond the crowd, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. The baby moved again, a gentle reminder of the future she still clung to. She rested her hand against her stomach, drawing strength from the small life inside. Faces blurred together in the heat, but certain details burned into her memory. A man with a crooked hat wiping sweat from his brow, a woman clutching a parasol with white-knuckled fingers, a boy staring wide-eyed until his mother pulled him back. Some looked away quickly, ashamed. Others stared openly, their eyes calculating. She could almost hear their thoughts. How much is she worth? What work can she do? Will the child survive? The humiliation pressed down like a weight, but she refused to bow her head. Her thoughts drifted to her late husband. She remembered the warmth of his hand, the way he had spoken of building a life together, the quiet promises made under the stars. He had been gentle, patient, and full of plans. His sudden death had left a hole that nothing could fill. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now, standing on a platform like livestock, their child hidden beneath the fabric of a borrowed dress. The memory of his smile brought a sharp ache to her chest, but it also gave her a flicker of strength. He would not want her to break. As the bidding began, the sound of numbers and offers filled the air. Some were shouted with false enthusiasm, others mumbled as if testing the waters. Each call made her stomach tighten. She felt like a prize at a fair, an object for trade, and the thought nearly made her falter. But she straightened her shoulders and focused on breathing. The crowd seemed to close in, the heat rising from the ground in shimmering waves. Her in-laws exchanged glances, eager for the highest price. They had reduced her to a transaction, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Then she noticed him. Among the shifting crowd stood a man apart, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the sun. He did not leer or whisper like the others. His gaze was steady, thoughtful, almost troubled. For a moment their eyes met. It was not the desperate look of someone searching for rescue, nor the cold calculation of a bidder. It was something different, a recognition of shared humanity, a silent acknowledgement of the wrong unfolding before them. She felt a strange steadiness in that moment, a reminder that even in a sea of cruelty, there were still eyes that could see her as more than a possession. The bidding continued, but the sound faded to a dull hum in her ears. That single glance lingered in her mind, a spark in the heavy air. She did not know who he was or why he stood apart, but the strength in his eyes gave her a fleeting sense of hope. Perhaps someone in this town still remembered what it meant to be human. Perhaps the world had not entirely forgotten kindness. Her heart pounded as the auctioneers pressed for higher offers. The men's voices grew sharper, their impatience clear. The crowd shifted like restless cattle, some eager for an end, others curious to see who would claim the prize. The woman tightened her grip on the rope that framed the platform. She thought again of the child within her, the tiny heartbeat she had felt against her own. Whatever happened next, she vowed silently, she would protect that life, even if it meant enduring more humiliation, even if it meant stepping into a future she could not yet imagine. She would not let the world crush the small miracle growing inside her. The man with the low-brimmed hat remained where he was, watching with a stillness that drew her attention again and again. His presence did not promise rescue, and she dared not believe in salvation. But in that endless moment of heat and noise, his steady gaze offered something she had nearly forgotten existed. The possibility that someone might see her not as a commodity, but as a person worth saving. The shouting rose and fell like the restless wind that swept through the square, each call sharper than the last. Numbers were thrown into the air, low at first, cautious, as if the bidders themselves felt the weight of what they were doing. A heavy-set man near the front cleared his throat and raised his hand. His voice carried above the murmurs, naming a figure that made the in-laws exchange quick, greedy glances. The crowd shifted, boots scraping against the dusty ground. Another man countered, his offer a notch higher, his eyes cold and appraising. It sounded like the buying and selling of cattle, the same clipped rhythm of a market day, But here the commodity was a young woman with a child in her womb. The pregnant bride stood unmoving, her chin held high though the sun pressed down like a hammer. She heard the numbers but refused to let them pierce her. Inside her chest her heart thudded with a painful force, but she kept her gaze fixed on the far hills, the only part of the world that still seemed free. Every shout was a reminder that her life had been reduced to a bargain. The baby shifted within her, a small flutter of life that steadied her resolve. She would not give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. At the edge of the gathering, the rancher felt the noise echo against his ribs. He had told himself to stay still, to watch without involvement, to let the world handle its own cruelty. Yet with each new bid something inside him tightened like a rope drawn taut. The voices of the bidders blurred into a dull roar. He saw only the young woman on the platform and the quiet strength in the way she refused to bow. Her stillness was more powerful than any shout. It stirred a memory of his mother standing against a storm, refusing to let the wind claim their home. That same unyielding courage now burned in this stranger, and it called to something buried deep within him. Another bid rang out, higher this time, followed by a ripple of murmurs. The in-laws leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the hunger of people who smelled profit. The rancher felt his jaw tighten. He thought of his barren fields, the debt waiting at the bank, the endless chores that already stole his sleep. He thought of the long nights he had spent alone, the echo of his own voice in empty rooms. He had nothing to offer a stranger but a worn house and a stubborn heart. Logic screamed that stepping forward would be madness. But the sight of her standing there, proud in the face of humiliation, silenced every argument. A thin man near the front raised his voice with a new number higher still. The rancher's stomach knotted. The in-laws exchanged satisfied smiles, their plan unfolding exactly as they intended. He felt a rush of heat surge through him, a force that made his hands curl into fists. He could not watch her sold like livestock. The thought of someone else claiming her, someone who might treat her with the same cruelty she had already endured, ignited a fire that burned through caution and fear. He stepped forward before his mind caught up with his body. The crowd parted slightly as he moved, their murmurs rising like a tide. Dust swirled around his boots with each deliberate stride. He stopped at the foot of the platform, close enough now to see the lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands, the determined set of her mouth. He lifted his hat in a quiet gesture of respect. The in-laws looked down at him, their surprise quickly masked by suspicion. "What's your offer?" one of them barked, his voice sharp. The rancher's gaze did not waver. "I'm not here to bid," he said, his tone steady and clear. "I'm here to marry her." The square fell into a stunned silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. The bidders froze, their raised hands slowly lowering as if unsure whether they had heard correctly. A woman near the back gasped, the sound sharp in the stillness. The young bride's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat the world held its breath. The in-laws exchanged a quick glance, their greed wrestling with confusion. "Marriage?" one finally repeated, his voice a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "That's right," the rancher said. "I'll marry her today, no bidding, no price. You'll get nothing but the promise that she and the child will have a home." A ripple moved through the crowd, whispers carrying from one mouth to the next. Some faces lit with curiosity, others with scorn. A man near the front chuckled, a dry sound that broke the tense silence. "You can't just walk in and marry a woman you don't know," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The rancher ignored him. His eyes remained fixed on the young woman, searching for a sign of her will. For the first time since the ordeal began, she looked directly at someone in the crowd and did not turn away. Her gaze met his, steady and questioning. There was no plea in her eyes, only a quiet astonishment, as if she were testing the truth of his words. He gave a small nod, not a command but an offer, a silent assurance that he meant every syllable. Something flickered in her expression, fear, hope, maybe both, but she did not lower her eyes. The in-laws sputtered, their earlier confidence crumbling. They demanded payment, insisting that a marriage would rob them of the compensation they sought. The rancher shook his head. "You don't own her," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "No one does. She's a free woman, and if she agrees to marry me, that's her choice. You'll get nothing but the satisfaction of knowing she's safe." The crowd stirred, emboldened by his words. Murmurs of agreement rose from a few brave voices. Someone called out that the in-laws had no legal claim. Another shouted that the whole spectacle was shameful. The tide of opinion began to shift, the auction losing its grip. The in-laws' faces tightened with frustration as they realized their advantage was slipping away. The rancher turned to the woman, his expression softening. "It's your decision," he said quietly, though the words carried to every ear. "I won't force you, but if you want a way out, I'll stand by you. We can be married before the sun sets." Her breath came fast, the weight of the moment pressing on her like the heat of the midday sun. She thought of the long nights of fear, the cold eyes of the family who had betrayed her, the uncertain future for the child she carried. She searched the rancher's face for signs of deception and found only steady resolve. He was a stranger, but his gaze held a kind of honesty she had not seen in a long time. Slowly she placed a hand over her belly, as if seeking guidance from the life within. Then she gave a single, deliberate nod. The square erupted with a chorus of gasps and murmurs. The rancher exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He climbed the steps to the platform, each footfall echoing in the charged silence. Standing beside her, he removed his hat and addressed the in-laws once more. "You heard her decision," he said. "This auction is over." The older man scowled, his mouth opening to protest, but the crowd's mood had shifted beyond his control. Neighbors who had once remained silent now stepped forward, their presence forming an unspoken barrier. Someone suggested fetching the town's preacher. Another mentioned the judge. A boy darted off to find the minister who kept an office near the church. The in-laws, sensing the futility of further argument, muttered curses and stepped back. The rancher turned to the woman, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "It'll be a hard life. I don't have much to offer but a home and my word." She met his eyes with a quiet strength that belied the tremor in her hands. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper yet clear enough to carry. "I'd rather face a hard life with choice than a rich one in chains." The preacher arrived moments later, breathless from the hurried summons. He looked from the rancher to the bride, then to the restless crowd, and seemed to grasp the urgency without explanation. With the sun sliding lower in the sky, he opened his worn Bible and began the simple ceremony. The townspeople gathered closer, their earlier curiosity softening into a quiet respect. The rancher took the young woman's hand in his, rough calluses against delicate skin, and repeated the vows with a steady voice. She echoed the words, her own voice trembling but firm. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a hush fell over the square, followed by a scattered cheer. The crowd began to disperse, whispers of amazement trailing behind them. The in-laws lingered for a moment, their faces twisted with resentment, before turning sharply and disappearing into the fading light. The rancher released a slow breath and looked down at the woman now standing beside him as his wife. Her shoulders eased for the first time that day, though her eyes still held a wary caution. He offered his arm, a silent promise of protection, and she accepted with a small, hesitant touch. Together they stepped down from the platform, the dust swirling around their feet as they walked through the parting crowd toward the waiting horizon. The sun had already begun to slip behind the low hills when they left the square, painting the sky in long streaks of copper and rose. The town, still buzzing with whispers of the sudden marriage, slowly faded behind them as the rancher led his horse toward the narrow trail that would take them home. The wagon waited near the edge of the square, and he helped her climb onto the wooden seat with a care that felt almost reverent. His hands, rough from years of hard work, were unexpectedly gentle as they steadied her. She settled beside him, the boards beneath them warm from the day's heat, her heart still hammering from the events that had unfolded so swiftly. He gathered the reins, gave a soft click of his tongue, and the horse began its slow journey out of town. Neither of them spoke at first. The creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves were the only sounds that filled the cooling evening. A faint breeze carried the smell of dry grass and distant pine, wrapping around them like a hesitant embrace. She kept her eyes on the fading light ahead, the long road stretching toward an unknown life. Each turn of the wheels seemed to carry her further from the humiliation of the square, yet deeper into a future she could not yet name. Her fingers rested protectively on her belly, tracing slow circles as the baby shifted inside. The rancher glanced at her now and then, his profile etched sharp against the amber sky, but he did not press her with questions. He simply guided the horse with quiet confidence, as though his steady presence might be enough to keep fear at bay. After a long stretch of silence, he spoke, his voice low and rough from years of shouting over wind and distance. "Are you comfortable enough?" She turned slightly, surprised by the softness of his tone. She nodded, though the wooden seat was hard and her back ached from the long day. "I'll stop if you need to rest," he added. She shook her head, offering the smallest of smiles. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange in the new air between them. He gave a short nod and returned his gaze to the trail. The landscape rolled out in quiet majesty around them. Shadows stretched across the prairie, and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. She caught herself stealing quick glances at the man beside her. His shoulders were broad beneath a faded shirt, his hands sure and steady on the reins. There was a calm strength about him, a kind of grounded patience that set him apart from the restless men she had known in town. Yet she also saw the faint lines of weariness on his face, the mark of years spent fighting a stubborn land. She wondered what had driven him to step forward in the square. Pity, duty, something else she couldn't yet understand. He seemed to sense her questions, though she remained silent. "I don't expect anything from you," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the trail. "I just couldn't stand there and let them treat you like that. No one should be sold." His words hung in the evening air, simple and firm. She studied his profile, searching for any hint of hidden motives, but found none. "You hardly know me," she murmured. "I know enough," he replied, and though he didn't elaborate, the certainty in his voice sent a small warmth through her chest. As the night deepened, the road grew rougher, and the horse slowed to navigate the uneven ground. The rancher pointed to a cluster of distant lights, faint but steady against the dark. "That's the ranch," he said. "It isn't much, but it's home." She followed his gaze, her heart tightening with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Home. The word felt heavy with promise and uncertainty. She wondered what awaited her there, a small house perhaps with rooms filled with silence. Would she be safe? Would she ever feel like she belonged? The trail narrowed as they approached the outer fences of his property. The scent of sagebrush mingled with the cool night air. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed across the hills. The rancher guided the horse through a wooden gate, leaning down to secure the latch with practiced ease. As they passed into the open pasture, the outline of a weathered barn came into view, its roof silver in the moonlight. Beyond it stood a modest house, its windows glowing faintly from a single lamp within. The sight stirred a surprising ache in her chest. After so many nights of fear and displacement, the simple promise of shelter felt almost overwhelming. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and hopped down, landing with a soft thud. Without a word, he turned and extended his hand to her. She hesitated only a moment before placing her palm in his. His grip was firm but careful as he helped her down, his other hand steadying her by the elbow. The ground beneath her feet felt different here, solid, grounded, like a place that might hold her weight without judgment. He released her hand slowly, as if reluctant to break the fragile connection. "I'll show you inside," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness beneath its calm exterior. He led her toward the porch, the boards creaking under their combined steps. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a small but tidy interior lit by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. The scent of wood and faint smoke wrapped around her as she stepped across the threshold. A worn table stood near the center of the room, its surface smooth from years of use. A stone fireplace sat against the far wall, a few embers still glowing faintly from the morning's fire. The space was simple, even spare, but it held a quiet warmth that spoke of care. "You can take the bedroom," he said, gesturing toward a door on the left. "I'll sleep out here for now. You need the rest more than I do." She turned to him, startled by the offer. "I can't take your room," she protested softly. "It's your house." He shook his head. "It's our house now," he said, the word ours landing with unexpected weight. "And you need a proper bed." Her throat tightened with gratitude and unease. No man had ever offered her kindness without expecting something in return. Yet his eyes held no hint of demand, only a quiet sincerity that left her momentarily speechless. She nodded and moved toward the bedroom, pausing at the doorway. "Thank you," she said, the words trembling with more meaning than their simplicity suggested. He gave a small nod, tipping his hat in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and deeply respectful. Inside the bedroom, the air smelled faintly of cedar. A narrow bed stood against the wall, covered with a quilt that bore the careful stitches of long-ago hands. She ran her fingers over the fabric, tracing the patterns as if they might reveal some secret about the man who had brought her here. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she felt the day's exhaustion seep into her bones. The baby kicked gently, a small reminder of the life that had guided her through fear and humiliation to this unexpected refuge. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe without the constant shadow of danger. In the main room, the rancher moved quietly, stoking the fire and setting a kettle of water on the stove. He listened to the soft creaks of the house settling around them, the faint rustle of her movements in the other room. A strange calm settled over him, mingled with a nervous energy he couldn't quite name. Hours ago he had been a solitary man resigned to a life of silence. Now a stranger, his wife, rested beneath his roof. He wondered what she thought of him, if she feared him, if she believed his promises. He vowed silently that he would earn her trust, no matter how long it took. When he finally knocked softly on the bedroom door to offer her a cup of warm tea, she opened it just enough to meet his eyes. The lamplight caught the faint curve of a tentative smile on her lips. She accepted the cup with careful fingers, their hands brushing for the briefest moment. That small touch sent an unexpected warmth through the quiet night, a fragile connection forged not by passion but by shared resolve. Neither of them knew what the days ahead would bring. The ranch was a place of relentless work and unpredictable seasons. Their marriage had begun not with courtship or vows of love, but with a desperate act of rescue. Yet as the night deepened and the prairie wind whispered against the walls, both felt a subtle shift inside, a recognition that, for the first time in a long while, they were no longer facing the world alone. Morning crept over the ranch in soft layers of gold and pale blue, the kind of quiet dawn that made every sound feel sharper and more alive. A rooster called somewhere behind the barn, and the faint clink of metal on wood drifted through the cool air. She woke slowly, her body heavy with the exhaustion of the day before. But for the first time in weeks, she did not wake to the sharp voice of her in-laws or the dread of another cruel command. Instead, there was only the muted crackle of a fire and the smell of brewing coffee. She lay still for a moment, listening to the gentle creaks of the house, letting the unfamiliar peace settle over her like a fragile blanket. The baby shifted inside her, a small kick that drew her back to the present. She placed a hand over her stomach and whispered a silent promise that they were safe, at least for now. Rising from the bed, she noticed the folded blanket on the chair and the small basin of fresh water left near the door. Someone had thought of her comfort, and the thought tightened her throat with quiet gratitude. She washed her face, smoothed her hair as best she could, and stepped into the main room. The rancher stood near the stove, his broad back to her as he poured coffee into two mismatched cups. Morning light streamed through the window, catching the rough edges of his shirt and the weary grace of his movements. He turned when he heard the door, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Morning," he said, his voice low and steady. "I hope you slept well." She nodded, murmuring a soft greeting. Words felt fragile in the quiet space, but his calm presence steadied her. He handed her a cup, the steam curling between them. She wrapped her hands around the warmth, letting it chase away the last chill of night. They sat at the worn wooden table, the silence between them no longer heavy but companionable. Outside, the ranch began to wake. Horses stamped in their stalls, cattle called in the distance, and the wind carried the clean scent of dew and sage. It was a hard land. She could see that even from the window, but there was a certain beauty in its openness, a sense of possibility hidden in the endless stretch of sky. After breakfast, he showed her around the small homestead. The barn smelled of hay and earth, the fences stretched toward distant hills, and a narrow stream wound its way through a patch of stubborn green. He explained the routines of ranch life, the feeding, the repairs, the constant battle with weather and time. His words were simple, almost shy, but she heard the quiet pride beneath them. This land might be worn and thirsty, yet it was his, carved from sweat and perseverance. As they walked, she noticed how he touched the wooden rails with a kind of reverence, as if each scar and splinter held a story worth remembering. Neighbors began to arrive as the sun climbed higher. A pair of older women from a nearby homestead came with a basket of bread and a jar of preserves, their eyes curious but kind. A wiry man with a weathered face brought a small bag of feed and a quiet nod of respect. They greeted her with cautious warmth, offering polite congratulations without pressing for details. Word of the auction had already traveled faster than the morning breeze. She felt their eyes linger on her belly, but there was no judgment in their gazes, only a tentative acceptance. The rancher stood close, his presence a silent shield against any unspoken questions. As the day unfolded, the rhythm of work took over. He mended a sagging section of fence while she helped gather eggs and sweep the porch. Simple tasks filled the hours, their shared effort weaving an unexpected sense of partnership. Every so often he would glance her way, offering a quiet instruction or a small smile. Each look carried an unspoken reassurance. "You belong here, at least as much as I do." She found herself breathing easier, the sharp edges of fear softening with each passing moment. But peace did not erase the shadows of the past. Late in the afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the trail leading to the ranch. The horse kicked up a trail of dust as it approached, and her heart tightened when she recognized the stiff posture of one of her in-laws. The man dismounted with a scowl, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the property. He demanded to speak, his voice sharp and accusing, claiming rights he no longer held. The rancher stepped forward, calm but unyielding. He listened without interruption, then spoke in a voice that carried the weight of quiet authority. "She is my wife," he said simply. "You have no claim here. Leave." The words fell like stones, steady and final. The man's face twisted with frustration, but the rancher did not waver. Neighbors who had lingered nearby stepped closer, their presence forming an unspoken wall of support. After a tense pause, the rider spat a curse into the dust and swung back into the saddle. They watched him retreat down the trail until he disappeared behind the hills. The woman released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The rancher turned to her, his eyes softening. "He won't trouble you again," he said quietly. She believed him. As evening settled over the ranch, the sky flared with the deep colors of sunset, burnt orange, violet, and a streak of crimson that lingered like a promise. They sat together on the porch, the wooden boards warm beneath them, watching the horizon fade into night. The day's labor had left them both tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from building rather than fleeing. The silence between them felt different now, less like a barrier and more like a shared understanding. The baby stirred again, and she rested a hand on her belly, a small smile tugging at her lips. The rancher noticed and offered a gentle glance. "How's the little one?" he asked. "Strong," she said softly, "stronger than I ever imagined." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out over the darkening fields. "That's good," he said. "This land needs strong hearts." The stars began to appear, one by one, bright against the velvet sky. She leaned back, letting the cool night air brush against her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future did not feel like a threat. It was still uncertain, filled with hard work and challenges she could barely predict, but it was no longer a cage. It was a path, rough, demanding, but open. Inside the house, a small lamp glowed through the window, casting a warm circle of light that beckoned them home. The rancher rose first, offering his hand without a word. She placed her palm in his, the touch steady and sure. Together they stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them as the wide prairie night stretched endless and silent beyond the walls, carrying their unspoken hopes into the stars.